You're now looking at the web interface for Saint, and we have a number of exciting new features coming out in Saint 10.5 Janus. First, I'll start with the asset imports. We have this new tab here, Asset Sources. We click on that, and the grid is empty at first, but we're going to go ahead and create an asset source. So you put in the IP address of your Active Directory server. You put in a username and password if you want to. That's not mandatory. You can enter it later. I'm going to go ahead and put in my own credentials for this Active Directory server. And then we have the option to test the connection. So that'll tell us right away whether we got the credentials correct. And we see that we did get it correct. It says success. And then we can click on server info. So that gathers a little bit more information. And in particular, it fills in the search base, which is down here. So that's going to be the base of the directory search that it uses when it's looking for assets in the directory. And then this field down here tells it which attributes to look for each of the assets that are collected. There's also this drop down here to match existing assets. So if there's a case where you may have already scanned some assets and now you're also going to import assets that you've already scanned, then you can choose to match it up by hostname. And then instead of creating a whole new asset, it'll just match it to the existing asset by hostname. And then background imports. It's off by default, but if I want to tell it to go ahead and re-import every hour to look for new assets or to look for assets which may have new attributes, then I'll enter 1 here. Then we click on Create and Import. So it created our asset source and it already enabled the background imports. Now I'm doing an on-demand import. And then it tells us that it found 2 new assets which it added. To see what assets it added, we'll go over here. There is a new column called Asset Source, which I'll enable. There's also an Asset Source GUID, which uniquely identifies the asset using its identifier from the directory. Once I do that, I can go over here, and then in this asset source column, we can see that there are 2 new assets, which were just imported from the Saint Dev source, this one and this one. We see the host names over here, but in addition to the host names, we see that it also created asset tags. For example, location Dallas right here, and location Bethesda over here. We also get a description. This one is an e-commerce server. And then this description tag here says that this machine here is for vendor management. So besides importing the host names, the assets themselves, it's also importing attributes and creating asset tags in the manager corresponding to the assets, which just got imported. Now that they've been imported, what do we do with them? Well, there's a new option in the scan wizard over here. So I'm going to call it Asset Source Scan. We choose the full vulnerability scan. And then over here in the More Options menu, there is this new option called Import Targets from Asset Source. So we'll click on that, and then it gives us the 2 assets that we just imported from our asset source. We can choose to scan both of those. Click on Apply. And you'll see here that both of those imported assets have now been added to our selected targets list for this scan job. And it's been added by GUID, this long, seemingly random number. That's the asset source GUID, which I was talking about before. And what that does is, by referencing the target by its GUID instead of by its IP address or hostname, that means anytime in the future when these assets change their IP address or host name, this job will still be able to scan those assets because it's going to resolve it by GUID instead of by something that could change, like the IP address or the host name. And then from there, we just go ahead and finish the scan job as usual. So that's about it for asset import. The next feature I wanted to show was a few new scan policies and report types. So we go back into our job wizard. And now if we look in the compliance scan policies, we're going to find two new ones that weren't there before, CMMC and Cyber Essentials. And if you select it, it gives you a little bit more information about it. So the CMMC scan policy runs all available vulnerability checks against the selected targets and supports the organization's compliance with cybersecurity maturity model certification. And then we get a similar write-up for Cyber Essentials. This is for the Cyber Essentials standard specified by the UK National Cyber Security Center. And then once we choose one of those scan policies, then we just step through the wizard as usual. So to save time, I'm not actually going to run those policies, but I already have some data from those policies. So I'm going to select one of those now. I'm going to choose the Cyber Essentials data from a Cyber Essentials scan policy, which was run previously. And then I'm going to create a report based on that. And then in the report wizard, you'll see that the Cyber Essentials report template is already selected for us because the scan job was the Cyber Essentials scan policy. So once we step through here, we'll change it to HTML since we're in an HTML browser. We generate the report. And this is the Cyber Essentials Vulnerability Assessment Report template. So you'll see that it starts off with an introduction, which tells us a little bit about the standard. And then it goes on to give us all the usual executive summary of the scan findings, overview of the scan findings, and finally the technical details all the way at the bottom, just like any other report type. And we get the same thing for CMMC as well. So if I want to choose the CMMC scan, which was run before, click OK there to create the report. And CMMC, which is another new report template, has been pre-selected for us since this scan job used the CMMC scan policy. And then once we generate that report, the same idea. So we get an introductory paragraph telling us a little bit of a background about the standard and the relevant controls. And then it gives us the executive summary. And then the overview of the scan results, just like before. So while I'm on the reports page, there's another interesting feature I wanted to show you. And that is this new button here, the download button. So any of these reports, once they've been generated, can be downloaded and saved for later. Okay, not that one because it was HTML. Let me generate a different report type to demonstrate this with. Let's say we want to do a PDF report. Okay, so it generates the PDF report. This is the same report we saw before, only now in PDF format. Close that. So I can download that, and it gives you a dialog giving you the option to zip the report. If you want to zip the report, then you can enter a password for some additional security. Then the recipient of the zip file would need that password in order to view the report. We also have the ability to do bulk email now. So this is a feature that didn't exist before. We can now choose to select any number of reports and then choose to email them all in bulk. So it used to be that you could only email them one at a time. Now we have the option to email them in bulk. We can zip the report. We can choose to download the zip file, and we can also enter a zip password for some additional security. So let me switch gears a little bit. I'm going to go to the network map. So I choose this scan here. So this is another new feature in Saint 10.5. So we now feature the ability to draw a network map of the targets which were scanned. So before we could only see the results in grid form. Now you can see the targets depicted graphically so that you can see how they're interconnected. So you can see that the scan originated from here. This is our scanner at the bottom. And then there was one machine that was directly connected to the scanner, and that's this printer here. And then this is a router here. So you hop through there, and then there are two more targets, which are one hop away, this firewall, and then this Windows machine. And then for the remaining targets, it goes out to the internet. So this cloud here is the internet. It hopped through this router, and then you can see that these three servers are out in the internet. So this network map kind of oversimplifies it a little bit, because in any internet route, there are going to be like 10 to 20 routers that it's going to hop through. But this kind of gives you the gist of it. All of these different parts of our network diagram, you can mouse over all of them to see more information. It'll give you the host name, IP address, host type, and the maximum CVS. And if we want to find out more about any of these machines, you can click on them, and it tells you what the highest CVSS score was, 2.3. And another example here, so we see that this machine had a vulnerability with a maximum CVSS score of 10. So we want to know what that vulnerability was. We click on this, and then it tells us that this is the vulnerability here, which had the CVSS score of 10. These are all color-coded by CVSS score, so that the ones with critical vulnerabilities will show up in red. There are other color coding schemes that we can use. So for example, if we want to color code by risk instead of by CVSS, we can click on that. And now it redraws the map. And now it's color coded by risk score instead. So for example, this Epson printer has a maximum risk of 240. If we click on it, then we can see which vulnerability it was. And it was this one here, the 240. The other options for color coding are risk forecast, saint severity, asset criticality, or we could also choose to have no color coding scheme. And we can also export any of our network maps to either PNG or JPEG if we so choose. I'm going to go over to the analytics now. So one thing you may notice here is that in Saint 10.5, we have a non-version specific CVSS score column. So in the past, you had to choose whether you wanted to show CVSS v2 or CVSS v3. And that was a little bit limiting, because if you're familiar with the National Vulnerability Database, they usually don't have both a v2 and a v3 score for every vulnerability. Usually it's just one or the other. So if you choose the CVSS v3 column, then you're only getting official scores for half the CVEs, and the other ones are kind of unofficial scores. So what we have now is we have one column called CVSS score. And the CVSS score is going to give you the highest version which exists in the National Vulnerability Database. So if the NVD has a CVSS v4 score, it'll show you the CVSS v4 score. Otherwise, if there's a 3.1 score, then it'll show you the 3.1 score. And if you're wondering which score you're looking at, that's an optional column. So I'm going to enable the CVSS version column. Put it right next to the CVSS score. And so now we can see which CVSS version we're looking at. So for this particular vulnerability here, the best available version in the NVD was version 2. And so it shows us the version 2 score, which was 10.0. For some of the other vulnerabilities that had a version 3.1 or a version 3.0 score available, and so it gives you that score instead. And then, see any here, but another new feature in 10.5 is we're now supporting CVSS version 4. So if I search for V4 here, we can see that some of the scores are V4. So this one, for example, had a CVSS V4 score available. And so it got a 9.3. Now, while we're looking at results, there's another new column I wanted to highlight, and that is the result comment. So previously, all scan results were uneditable. There was really nothing you could change about it. I mean, you could choose to exclude it, you could dispute it, but you couldn't change anything in the actual scan result record. Now we have the option to do so. There is this comment button. If you click on the comment button, then you can enter whatever comment you want. So the comment has been saved. And then if we scroll over to the result comment column over here, then we can see not only the comment we just added, but which user added it. So that if you have multiple users all using the system, you can see which user added which comments. And if you want to search for a particular comment or a particular user's comment, then you can use this filter toolbar up here. So I typed in admin, and so now it shows me just the vulnerabilities that have an admin comment. And if you have a lot of comments to make, or if you want to make the same comment about a handful of vulnerabilities, rather than doing it one by one, we also support bulk comments. So you can highlight a number of rows, go to result comment, and then enter a bulk comment here. That comment then appears over here in the far right column for all of the vulnerabilities that were selected. And the last thing I wanted to highlight today was data set aggregation. I'm going to select the data set. Now, notice these two jobs, and there are 4 scans here. So 2 of the scans ran on February 17. The other 2 scans ran on March 19. So basically the way these scans are structured is the monthly scans are divided up into 2 jobs, one job for Windows targets, one job for Linux targets. So when you're looking at a 2-month window, and there are essentially 4 scans, 2 from February, 2 from March. But we still want to do trend analysis on all of them together, right? We don't want to have 2 separate reports. So that's where the data set aggregation comes into play. We're going to create a report. I'm going to choose trend analysis. And we're going to go forward to the advanced options. And then under the trend analysis options here, there's this new field here called data set aggregate. The default is not to aggregate, which would mean it would analyze all 4 of those scans uh, as if those 4 all needed to be compared with each other. But that doesn't really make sense in this case because 2 of them were Windows and 2 of them were Linux. What we actually want to do here is aggregate monthly. That way it will take all of the results from February and compare them with all of the results from March to give you a holistic trend analysis between February and March. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So this is our trend analysis. And you can see now when we go down to this vulnerability history down here, we have a bar for February and a bar for March. So the 4 data sets have been aggregated so that it's actually treated as 2 data sets, February compared to March.
One of the things that we find in these compliance reports, it's unlike maybe PCI, internal and external, where there's very specific pass-fail metrics, things like that we're using that map specifically to the scan. Things like CMMC and Cyber Essentials, one thing to keep note for everybody is it's great to have a default scan template that does the vulnerability scan. But some of these requirements and these standards also have additional controls, such as configuration benchmark assessments or software inventory. And we have specific scan policies for those type of things. So just running a vulnerability scan policy may not give them everything they need to make an assumption that if I just run the CMMC scan or just the Cyber Essentials scan, then that meets all the requirements that the report template is going to display. They need to understand that if you're doing more things than just a vulnerability assessment as part of your CMMC reporting or your Cyber Essentials, and you want to do an assessment for, say, a collection doing configuration benchmarks, then they can still do the report. They just have to run the Cyber Essentials scan and the applicable benchmark scans. And when they get to the report, make sure they include both of those scans for the aggregation of the data to be produced in that one report. So it's just a little subtlety on, there might be other controls other than that you run a vulnerability scan, and the advantage of our reporting being able to merge different data sets. Yes, you can run the CMMC scan for the vulnerability management, but if you want to include, say, a benchmark scan, that won't be included in the CMMC scan. That's a separate scan, but you can aggregate those 2, select both scans to produce your consolidated report.
Yeah, it's good to keep in mind that these report templates don't necessarily have to be married to the scan policy. So you can still use the CMMC report template even if you ran a different scan policy.